The night was silent over Kuwait. Stars hung low above the desert, and the massive sprawl of Camp Arifjan, one of the most critical American military installations in the entire Middle East, sat under the hum of generators and the quiet breath of over 10,000 United States troops resting inside its perimeter. Some were sleeping. Some were on duty. Some were writing letters home. None of them knew what was already in the air, hurtling toward them at supersonic speed. Then the sirens began to scream. What happened in the hours that followed would send shockwaves through every capital on earth, from Washington to Tehran, from Riyadh to Tel Aviv, from Beijing to Brussels. This was not a drill. This was not a warning shot. This was Iran, and America was about to answer. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to understand what Camp Arifjan actually is. It is not just a military base. It is the beating heart of American power projection across the Persian Gulf region. Situated in Kuwait, just miles from the Iraqi border and within striking range of Iran, Arifjan serves as a logistics hub, a command center, and a forward staging ground for American forces throughout the broader Middle East theater. It houses the U.S. Army Central Arsenal and has served as a critical node for every major American military operation in the region since the Gulf War. More than 10,000 troops were stationed there. Soldiers, airmen, contractors, intelligence officers, logistics personnel. The base's vast warehouses stacked with ammunition, armored vehicles lined in rows, communication towers linking commanders directly to the Pentagon. Hitting Camp Arifjan would not just be a military strike. It would be a message to the entire world. Iran is no longer playing defense. So why did they do it? What could have possibly driven Tehran to take a step that every analyst, every diplomat, every hawk, and every dove had said for decades would be catastrophic, irreversible, the point of no return? The answer lies in a chain of events that had been building for months, each link forged in blood and fire, each decision pulling the two nations closer to the edge of the abyss. In the weeks leading up to the strike, tensions in the region had reached a fever pitch. Israeli operations in Lebanon and Gaza had continued, with Iran-backed Hezbollah and Hamas suffering heavy losses. Iran's proxy network, its so-called axis of resistance, was bleeding. The Houthis in Yemen had launched wave after wave of drone and missile attacks on Red Sea shipping lanes and had faced relentless American and coalition airstrikes in response. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria had been targeted repeatedly by American air power, and in Tehran, the pressure on the supreme leader was immense. The Revolutionary Guard commanders were furious. The hardliners in parliament were calling for retaliation. The voices of restraint were being drowned out by the drums of war. And then came the strike that changed everything. A senior commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, one of the most powerful military figures in Iran's entire security apparatus, was killed in a precision strike. The details of where and how remain partially classified, but American and Israeli fingerprints were all over it. Tehran erupted, the streets filled with mourners and protesters. The supreme leader issued a statement that was short, cold, and absolute. There would be a response, and it would be one the enemy would never forget. The world watched and waited. Most analysts expected what had become the familiar playbook: a barrage of missiles fired at Israel, or perhaps drone swarms aimed at American patrol vessels in the Gulf, or even attacks on oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, something large enough to satisfy domestic anger, but calibrated carefully enough to avoid crossing the final red line that had always been Iran's strategy: push hard, but don't push so hard that the Americans come all the way through the door. This time they calculated differently. Iranian strategic planners made a decision that stunned even their own allies. Rather than hitting Israel directly, rather than targeting Saudi oil fields or Emirati ports, they chose to strike the symbol of American military presence itself. Camp Arifjan, the nerve center, the garrison, the place where 10,000 American soldiers lived and worked and slept. The attack came in multiple waves. The first wave consisted of ballistic missiles, not the older, less accurate variants Iran had used in previous strikes, but newer, upgraded versions with improved guidance systems. These were followed almost simultaneously by swarms of armed drones, hundreds of them, saturating the airspace and designed to overwhelm air defense systems through sheer numbers, and mixed into the drone swarms were cruise missiles flying at low altitude, designed to slip under radar coverage and arrive without warning. The air defense systems at Camp Arifjan, Patriot batteries, THAAD interceptors, and additional systems deployed in the weeks of rising tension activated immediately. American operators worked frantically, tracking inbound threats, prioritizing intercepts, burning through interceptor missiles at a rate never seen outside of wargame simulations. Liaison officers were screaming into phones. Commanders were issuing rapid-fire orders. The base alarm systems were blaring across every inch of the compound. Troops scrambled to hardened shelters. Armored vehicles were moved. Aircraft were dispersed. The entire base went into emergency lockdown in what would later be described as the most intense alert activation in the history of American military presence in Kuwait. The interception rate was remarkably high, given the scale and sophistication of the attack. American air defenses performed extraordinarily well, but no system is perfect. No defense is impenetrable, and Iran had sent enough projectiles to ensure that some would get through. Several warheads impacted inside the base perimeter. Warehouses were struck. A logistics facility took a direct hit. A section of the base near the motor pool was heavily damaged. There were casualties. American military personnel were injured. Some were killed. The exact numbers in the immediate aftermath were classified, but the images that leaked the smoke rising over the Kuwaiti desert, the satellite imagery showing the craters and the structural damage told the story that no official would say out loud. Iran had done it. Iran had hit a major American military base and killed American soldiers on Kuwaiti soil. The world held its breath. In Washington, the reaction was swift and seismic. The National Security Council convened within minutes of the first reports. The president was briefed. The Joint Chiefs of Staff gathered in the Pentagon's war room. Within the hour, American forces across the entire Central Command area of responsibility from Kuwait to Bahrain to Qatar to the carriers in the Gulf were elevated to their highest state of readiness. Airborne early warning aircraft extended their orbits. Submarines moved into position. Strike packages were prepared. This was not the moment for diplomacy. This was the moment every war planner had been preparing for and praying would never come. The American response when it came was massive and overwhelming. U.S. air power struck Iranian missile facilities, the very sites from which the ballistic missiles had been launched. Revolutionary Guard command posts were obliterated. Iranian naval assets in the Persian Gulf were targeted. An Iranian radar installation that had provided targeting data for the strike on Arifjan was destroyed within hours, and American cyber capabilities, among the most advanced on Earth, went to work on Iran's military communications infrastructure, degrading their ability to coordinate a second wave. But the deeper question, the question that analysts and historians and policymakers will debate for years, was not about the military exchange. The deeper question was, what comes next? Because a line had been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. Iran had directly struck American troops on the territory of a U.S. ally. American soldiers had died. The rules of engagement that had governed this shadow war for decades, the careful dance of proxy conflict and plausible deniability, had been torn apart. What existed now was something different, something more dangerous. Something that could escalate into a full regional war, drawing in Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and potentially even Russia and China, each with their own interests and their own calculations. Kuwait itself was in a state of shock. The Kuwaiti government, which had hosted American forces for decades in a relationship built on mutual interest and shared security concerns, now found itself in the middle of a direct military confrontation on its own soil. Emergency sessions of the Kuwaiti parliament were called. Civilians near the base were evacuated. The country's own military went to full alert. In the Gulf states, the mood shifted from anxiety to alarm. Saudi Arabia, the way, Bahrain, all of them home to significant American military infrastructure, began emergency consultations with Washington. The question on every mind in every royal court and every cabinet room: are we next? Tehran, for its part, issued a statement through state media that was defiant and unapologetic. The strike, they said, was a legitimate act of self-defense. It was a response to American aggression, American interference, American imperialism in the region. The supreme leader appeared publicly and declared that Iran had shown it was not afraid. The Revolutionary Guard released footage they claimed showed the missiles being launched, the drones being deployed, the operation proceeding exactly as planned. It was propaganda, yes, but it was also truth. They had done it, and they were proud. But behind closed doors in Tehran, there was fear as well. The decision-makers who had authorized the strike knew what they had set in motion. They knew the Americans would respond with overwhelming force. They knew the economic consequences. The sanctions already strangling Iran's economy would be tightened further, possibly to a breaking point. They knew that Iran's nuclear program, already under extreme pressure, was now at risk of becoming a target in ways it had never been before. The calculus had been better to strike now from a position of perceived strength than to wait until the axis of resistance had been completely dismantled and Iran stood alone. Whether that calculus was right, whether this strike made Iran safer or more vulnerable, was a question only history would answer, and history was watching. The world in the days that followed the strike on Camp Arifjan was a different world. Emergency sessions of the United Nations Security Council were called, though the usual diplomatic theater unfolded exactly as expected: Russia and China blocking Western resolutions, the Americans dismissing Iranian justifications, the smaller nations desperately calling for de-escalation while privately scrambling to understand which side they needed to be on. Oil prices spiked immediately. Financial markets convulsed. Shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz, through which a fifth of the world's oil supply passes, were thrown into uncertainty as Iranian naval forces conducted exercises and American warships held their positions. The global economy, already fragile, felt the tremors of what was happening in the desert. And yet amid all of this, there was one thing that defined this moment more than anything else. 10,000 American men and women had been inside that base when the missiles came down. Some of them would never go home, but the others, the ones who had scrambled to the shelters, who had fired the interceptors, who had treated the wounded in the chaos of the first hours, they were still there, still standing, still doing their jobs. Because that is what soldiers do, even when the world is burning around them, Even when the calculation of great powers turns into fire and smoke and the smell of burning metal in the desert night, they stand at their posts, they hold the line, they wait for orders, they carry the wounded, they call home when they can. This is not the end of the story. In the Middle East, it never is. Every strike leads to a counterstrike. Every escalation creates new conditions for the next escalation. The players change, the weapons change, the tactics evolve, but the fundamental dynamics, the competition for power, for influence, for security, for survival, those remain constant. What is different now is the scale. What is different now is that a threshold has been crossed. A direct military confrontation between Iran and the United States, the thing that diplomats and generals had tried for decades to prevent, has happened, and the world will never look at the Middle East the same way again. The sirens over Camp Arifjan fell silent eventually. The smoke cleared, the damage assessment teams moved in, the medical teams worked through the night, and somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness of the Kuwaiti desert, an American soldier sat outside a hardened shelter, staring at the sky, the same sky that had just tried to kill him, and wondered what came next. That question, what comes next, is the question the entire world is now asking, and the answer will shape the next decade of history. Stay with us, because this story is far from over.